The most powerful woman in America couldn't protect her own daughters. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, that's Schermerhorn, spent roughly 3 decades as the absolute arbiter of New York's elite. She decided who mattered and who didn't, and the decision was delivered not through legislation or courts, but through something more brutal: the guest list. Her ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue held roughly 400 people, and that architectural fact became the working definition of Gilded Age society itself. In March 1888, her social arbiter Ward McAllister told the New York Tribune there were only about 400 people in fashionable New York society. The implication was precise and merciless. Everyone outside that room didn't exist. By February 16, 1892, McAllister made it official, publishing the definitive list in the New York Times. It ran to just 319 names, including his own. Bankers, lawyers, brokers, real estate men, and railroaders. 1 editor, 1 publisher, 1 artist, 2 architects. People who made the cut felt it like a title of nobility. The people who didn't felt it like an execution. Caroline's approval functioned as a currency more valuable than cash, because cash could be earned. Her approval had to be granted. In 1883, she formally acknowledged Alva Smith Vanderbilt, meaning the Vanderbilts, the wealthiest new money family in America, had stood outside the inner circle until Caroline chose to open the door. That single gesture rippled through New York like a coronation. She had built a social empire from nothing except inherited Dutch family prestige and a willingness to enforce invisible rules with iron consistency. The man whose fortune funded every ball, every gown, every strategic dinner was William Backhouse Astor Jr. He inherited the equivalent of $1.4 billion in today's money when his father died in 1875, and he had essentially no interest in how his wife deployed it socially. He preferred the Ambassadress, at the time the largest private yacht in the world, or horseback riding at Ferncliff, his Hudson River estate. He spent his years on women, gambling, horse racing, and the open sea. His absence gave Caroline exactly the space she needed. It also meant she built her empire on money she didn't legally control, in service of children she couldn't legally protect. That distinction is the entire story. Caroline and William had 5 children. Emily arrived first in 1854. Helen followed in 1855. Then Charlotte in 1858. Carrie in 1861. And finally, in 1864, came the only son, John Jacob Astor IV, known as Jack. He was the youngest child and the only boy, and those 2 facts determined the entire trajectory of the family. The daughters were assets to be placed. Jack was the heir. He would eventually die worth roughly $87 million, the equivalent of $2.9 billion today, and become one of the most famous men in modern history before he turned 48. His sisters would become footnotes. The pattern starts with Emily. She was the eldest, which meant she was the first to test the family's machinery, and the machine showed its teeth immediately. Emily fell in love with James John Van Allen, a socialite her father considered beneath the family. William Backhouse Astor Jr.'s response was the kind of thing that gets preserved in family accounts because of its cartoonish ferocity. "Damned if I want my family to have anything to do with the Van Allens." Van Allen's response was to challenge his would-be father-in-law to a duel. They had chosen their seconds and agreed on a site before William capitulated, announcing he saw no reason to waste his life on a Van Allen. His daughter's happiness wasn't the deciding factor. His own inconvenience was. Emily married Van Allen in March 1876. They had 3 children, Mary, James, and Sarah. On November 21, 1881, Emily died in Newport, Rhode Island, giving birth to the third. She was 27 years old. She had been negotiated over, dueled over, barely won, and then lost to a pregnancy her father hadn't wanted to authorize. She had been dead for more than a decade before the family's worst scandals broke. Helen, born in 1855, at least got a famous connection out of her marriage. She wed James Roosevelt, known as Rosie, in November 1878 at Grace Church. Rosie was the older half-brother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man contemporaries described as an aimless, if charming member of New York society's sporting set. That phrase, in the vocabulary of the era, means he coasted on breeding and spent money he hadn't earned. The marriage produced 2 children. It didn't produce a long life. Helen died on November 12, 1893, in Chelsea, London, at 34 years old. The cause, according to John D. Gates in his account of the Astor family, was an overdose of laudanum. Official records list it as unspecified. Either way, she died in a foreign city, far from her mother's ballroom, and the circumstances weren't the kind that got preserved in flattering family portraits. 2 of the 4 Astor daughters were dead before their 40th birthdays. Neither death generated the headlines their scandals would have. Death, for an Astor daughter, was quiet. Scandal wasn't. Carrie Astor, born in October 1861, the 4th daughter, produced the one story from this family that feels surgically modern and almost unbearable in what it reveals. In the early 1880s, she fell in love with Marshall Orme Wilson. Her mother's objection was immediate and absolute. Wilson's father, Richard Thornton Wilson, was a banker from Loudon, Tennessee, who had served on the staff of the Confederacy's Commissary General and grown rich in railway investments, a background that attracted accusations of war profiteering. In Mrs. Astor's taxonomy of New York society, that biography wasn't a complicated case. It was a disqualification. Carrie had no legal mechanism to override her mother. She had no financial independence. She had no vote, no veto, no instrument the law of 1884 would recognize. So she used the only thing she actually controlled. She stopped eating. The accounts describe Carrie as having starved herself into bulimia, a sustained physical collapse that reached her mother's social circle and, eventually, her mother's conscience. Mrs. Astor relented when she understood her daughter's life was genuinely at risk. On November 18, 1884, Carrie Astor married Marshall Orme Wilson at the Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The most radical protest available to a woman of her class was self-destruction. Carrie outlived Marshall by 22 years and died in 1948 at 86, the last surviving Astor sibling. The marriage was functional enough, but the cost of obtaining permission to enter it, paid in her own body, says more about the era's architecture of female agency than any social column ever printed. Then there is Charlotte. Charlotte Augusta Astor, born March 29, 1858, is the emotional and evidentiary center of everything this family tried to bury. When Charlotte married J. Coleman Drayton on October 20, 1879, her father structured a dowry, the annual income from $500,000, at the era's standard 5% interest rates, roughly $25,000 per year, plus a Manhattan mansion at 374 Fifth Avenue. She entered the marriage with more material comfort than most American women of any class would ever encounter. What she didn't have was any mechanism to hold on to it if the marriage failed. By the early 1890s, the marriage had failed in every meaningful sense. Drayton carried a reputation in social circles for what contemporaries called indiscretions, a word that, in Gilded Age parlance, covered exactly the kind of affairs that would soon destroy Charlotte publicly. She began a relationship with Hallett Alsop Barrow, son of Samuel Barrow, vice president of the Equitable Life Assurance Society. Rumors had circulated in London and Paris for roughly 2 months before March 1892. Then, it exploded. On March 18, 1892, the Evening Journal ran the headline, "Society Scandal. The Astor Beauty, Mrs. Coleman Drayton, the Cause." Drayton had sailed on the Majestic from Liverpool. Barrow, on learning this, took the Irish mail train at 8 o'clock Wednesday night, raced ahead of the ship, and overtook it at Queenstown, Modern Cove, boarding before the Atlantic crossing. Both men were now on the same vessel. Newspapers on both sides of the ocean were watching every port. Drayton challenged Barrow to a duel in Paris. Friends of both men intervened before it could be fought. Caroline Astor herself, the woman who could make or break any family's social standing in New York with a turned shoulder, traveled to London to broker a reconciliation between her daughter and son-in-law. The supreme social gatekeeper in America couldn't resolve her own daughter's marriage. The instruments she'd spent 30 years sharpening were useless here, because this fight wasn't social. It was financial and legal, and those domains belonged entirely to men. William Backhouse Astor Jr. died on April 25, 1892, of an aneurysm at the Hotel Liverpool in Paris. He was 62 years old. His will was the final exercise of control he would perform over his family's women, and he exercised it with precision. Charlotte was disinherited. He left $850,000 to her children, the equivalent of roughly $30.4 million in today's purchasing power, but placed it in a trust. The administrator of that trust was J. Coleman Drayton, the man with his own documented reputation for infidelity, who had publicly humiliated his wife in an international media spectacle, now legally controlled the money set aside for their shared children. Charlotte received nothing directly from her father's estate. Her brother Jack, heir to tens of millions, immediately gave her $1 million as a personal gesture, worth approximately $35.7 million in today's purchasing power. It wasn't legally compelled. It was charity from the son who got everything. Charlotte countersued Drayton in 1894 on grounds of desertion and non-support. The divorce finalized in 1896. Drayton kept custody of the children. Charlotte lost them, along with everything else. The double standard wasn't subtle in its operation. Drayton's rumored affairs hadn't cost him his social standing, his finances, his New York life, or his children. Charlotte's confirmed affair cost her all of it simultaneously. The legal and social machinery of 1890s New York was functioning precisely as designed. Divorce law granted custody to fathers by default. Disinheritance was a father's unilateral right. Social ostracism for a woman who had brought scandal onto an old family name wasn't optional. It was enforced. Charlotte left for Europe. She wouldn't truly return. Drayton's trajectory is instructive. He settled eventually in Newport, Rhode Island, where he died on November 11, 1934, at the age of 82. Described in accounts as having passed after a lingering illness. He outlived Charlotte by 14 years and died in the same social world that had expelled her, having faced none of the consequences she faced for behavior no worse than his own. In Europe, Charlotte rebuilt. She married George Ogilvy Haig, a Scottish whiskey heir who was the brother of Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the commander who led the British Army through the Western Front in the First World War. They lived at 65 Brook Street, off Grosvenor Square in London, a respectable address, a different universe from 350 Fifth Avenue. Whether she had any meaningful ongoing contact with the children Drayton kept, the record offers almost nothing. Charlotte had been erased from the American social world so comprehensively that her post-exile existence survives in scattered references, genealogical records, and secondary accounts that require assembly from fragments. On July 30, 1920, Charlotte Augusta Haig, born Astor, died at the American Hospital in Paris in the suburb of Neuilly, where she had been living since Haig's death. Her sister Carrie was at her bedside. She was 62 years old, the same age her father had been when he died in the same city and cut her out of his will 28 years earlier. Now, the brother. John Jacob Astor IV was born July 13, 1864, the only son, 3 years younger than Carrie and 10 years younger than Charlotte. He inherited the architecture of a dynasty built by men for men. He served as a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War, wrote a science fiction novel, built real estate across Manhattan, and married twice. The second time to 18-year-old Madeline Force, which generated its own controversy of the kind that men of his class survived with their fortunes intact. On April 15, 1912, he was aboard the RMS Titanic on its maiden voyage. He was the wealthiest passenger on the ship, worth approximately $87 million, the equivalent of $2.9 billion today. He helped Madeline into a lifeboat and went down with the ship. Upon his death, $69 million of his $85 million estate passed to his son Vincent. Jack died in one of the most famous disasters in human history and has been named in virtually every account of the Titanic written since. His 3 sisters who died in varying degrees of obscurity, Emily at 27 in Newport, Helen at 34 in a London flat, Charlotte at 62 in a Paris hospital after 2 decades of exile, don't appear in those accounts. The dynasty preserved him in amber and dissolved them. Strip away the ballroom mythology and what the Astor family actually was becomes clear. A wealth transfer mechanism that used women as placement tools, discarded them when they became complicated, and expunged them from its own memory. The legal instruments weren't unusual for the era: trusts administered by husbands, inheritances withheld by fathers. New York divorce law in the 1890s awarded custody to men and social death to women as a matter of standard procedure. Caroline Astor, for all her inherited Schermerhorn money that gave her more independence than most women of her time, couldn't override her husband's will or any judge's custody ruling. The social power she'd spent 30 years constructing operated in a domain entirely separate from the legal and financial power that actually determined her daughters' lives. Ward McAllister, her co-architect of New York's social hierarchy, died in January 1895. At his funeral at Grace Church, only 5 patriarchs attended, and fewer than 20 of the 400. Mrs. Astor was absent. She had a dinner party that night. Whether that was indifference or the mechanical continuation of a performance that had long outlasted its meaning, the image carries its own weight. The woman who never stopped showing up, still showing up, even as the world she'd built was already dissolving. The active influence Mrs. Astor enjoyed over society peaked in 1891, wrote John D. Gates. The following year, the Charlotte scandal broke, William died in Paris, and the 400 list was published and found to contain only 319 names. The year after that, in November 1893, Helen died of a laudanum overdose in London. The peak was immediately followed by a collapse, and the collapse came from the only direction where her power had never actually applied: her children. The Astor name, as history received it, belongs to 2 men: John Jacob Astor I, who built the fortune in the early 19th century, and Jack Astor IV, who died famously in the North Atlantic in 1912. Emily, Helen, Charlotte, Carrie, biographical footnotes in accounts primarily concerned with real estate holdings and celebrity death. Charlotte's erasure required institutional effort: disinherited, divorced, stripped of her children, exiled to Europe, remarried under a different surname, buried in Paris. The dynasty functioned exactly as its legal and social architecture intended. Women absorbed the scandal and the punishment. Men retained the money and the reputation. and history found it easier to remember the famous drowning than the 4 quiet diminishments that preceded it. Carrie Astor Wilson died September 13, 1948, at the age of 86, the last of the siblings. She had outlived Emily by 67 years, Helen by 55, Charlotte by 28, and the entire Gilded Age social world her mother had constructed. By 1948, almost no one was asking about the Astor sisters. The dynasty had already decided what it wanted to remember, and it had decided decades earlier. These 4 women weren't the exceptions to how the system worked. They were the system working, the gilded machinery of inherited wealth, using women as instruments of social placement, and then discarding the instruments when they became inconvenient. Emily used to produce a Van Allen marriage and die in the producing of it. Helen used to attach an Astor to a Roosevelt name and die in a London flat at 34. Charlotte used to seal a union with the Drayton family and then surgically removed when the union became a liability. Carrie used to extend the family into new money territory, her compliance purchased with the threat of watching her starve herself to death. Mrs. Astor decided who mattered in New York for 30 years. History decided she mattered more than her daughters. The name endures through its fortune makers and its titanic dead. The women who carried it were crushed by it and were ultimately written out of it. They are exactly as forgotten as the system that forgot them was designed to ensure. Subscribe for more stories like this one. There are plenty that history decided not to keep.